Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live conversation. If you happen to be catching the recording, thank you for taking the time to listen in. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Loretta Turner. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the founder and organizational well being strategist at Do Good Leadership Collective. I will be the host. There we go. I will be the host of today's webinar, but I also want to keep the invitation open for all of you to make this conversation interactive. So please use the comments, please use the chat function to ask questions, and I will answer those questions in the Q&A section at the end of this presentation. And even if you are watching the recording, please add your comments or questions via the comments, and we'll make sure to respond to you as soon as we see that message. So, if you are new to our work, folks, what we want you to know is that we exist to help social impact professionals do good and be well. We know that social impact professionals is a broad term that encompasses a larger workforce, and our work at Do Good Leadership Collective primarily focuses on those who work within nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, and philanthropic institutions. We're based in sunny San Diego, California, although we do have a national reach. We support organizations and their leaders through coaching, workshops, and trainings, staff retreats, community events, including a free virtual book club that anyone is able to join. And today's webinar in particular is focused on our latest research titled Who Burns Out and Why? We released this work in May 2026 as a way to honor Mental Health Awareness Month, recognizing that nonprofit leaders are navigating a lot of crises that are impacting their well-being and their mental health. These resources can be found on our website and includes a 10-page white paper with over 20 references, a corresponding infographic, and a free downloadable resource kit for managers and supervisors who seek to improve burnout conditions within their teams and organizations. At the end of the webinar, I'll remind you of these resources and how you can access them, as well as share some updates on free offerings that we're making available in the coming months. So, what I really want to share with you all is the why behind the research, right? Why did we even take the time to put this work together? We are asking who burns out and why, because we've had the honor and pleasure of learning from Dr. Christina Maslock, who posed this exact question early on in her burnout research. Dr. Maslock is a social psychologist, and she is the founder of the Maslock Burnout Inventory, which is the most widely used assessment for measuring burnout. Dr. Maslock taught us that burnout is not an individual feeling, and that it is very critical that we ask questions about burnout from an organizational and systemic lens. And so the reason we are choosing to elevate this work now is because burnout is an ongoing crisis that plagues the nonprofit and social impact sector. In fact, the Center for Effective Philanthropy just reported for the fourth year in a row that burnout is a major concern for nonprofit leaders and a risk for nonprofit impact. Our hope is that this conversation today and that our research provides an additional lens, not just on what the data says about burnout, but also the solutions and the innovations that we might consider going forward if we can take an equitable approach. Additionally, we hope that this webinar helps to create a better understanding of what burnout is and what burnout isn't. Because what we know to be true is that burnout is widely misunderstood as a personal issue, as a personal failing that can be solved by self care and resiliency. But in reality, our research, along with the work of Dr. Maslock, the World Health Organization, and other leaders in the field, have shown us again and again that burnout is systemic in nature and is caused by unmanaged workplace stress. Our research also points to the fact that burnout does not impact everyone equally. That's why we're having this conversation today. Our research points to the fact that an individual's role and identity are actually key factors in understanding how they might experience burnout at work. Finally, we know that there are no one size fits all approaches to dealing with burnout. And that leads us to the content of the webinar today, which covers 7 different populations that appear to be experiencing burnout at accelerated rates. A few notes before I dive into this list of populations. Firstly, this research is informed by our work in supporting nearly 100 nonprofit leaders and dozens of organizations across the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. Our insights are backed by articles and research from nearly 20 organizations, including the nonprofit finance fund's Heart of the Sector report that was released earlier this year. The groups we are presenting are presented alphabetically and are not ranked by level of risk. We know that this list is not exhaustive, and we continue to follow research that speaks to other populations impacted by burnout that are not mentioned in our research today. So let's go ahead and dive into our first population. The first group that we're covering are Black leaders and Black-led organizations. There is a lot of data about Black leadership within the nonprofit and philanthropic spaces. We pulled the resources for our white paper from groups including Bridgespan, Echoing Green, Giving Gap, and the independent sector. What we learned is that some of the biggest indicators of burnout for Black leaders are resource gaps, AKA Black leaders and their organizations consistently receive less funding and institutional support. What we also noted as a factor for Black leaders is what has been coined as the racial funding cliff, which was when philanthropy abruptly pulled away from racial justice funding after the racial uprising in 2020, which impacted a lot of Black-led organizations. And thirdly, a third factor is the general financial hardships that Black leaders and workers face in comparison to their non-Black or their white peers. I think it's important that we're kicking off this conversation and this research with these data points, because what it shows us right away is that the causes of burnout are not as simple as heavy workloads. And now workloads can absolutely be a factor in burnout, but when we look at the unique and the nuanced challenges that specific populations face, it adds more context and it adds more texture to how burnout can emerge within organizations, which then helps us figure out how we can create more equitable solutions. And again, just as a reminder, folks, I want y'all to be conversating with me. So please engage in the chat. If you have questions, if you just have comments, feel free to share them and I'll be revisiting them when we get to the end of our conversation. And even if you're watching the recording, please add some comments. We will get back to them as soon as we can. Alrighty, let's go ahead and look at our next population, which is executive directors and CEOs. Like I mentioned earlier, burnout risk can be tied to identity, but it also can be tied to specific roles within organizations. We have learned a lot about executive directors and CEOs and their unique burnout from our work with leaders, alongside information from Board Source that speaks to the burdens and the isolation and the internalization that these leaders are experiencing. When I think about the challenges that executive directors and CEOs are experiencing with burnout, I frequently think of the notion when people say that it's lonely at the top. And while we know that top leaders within social impact organizations are supposed to lean on their boards for support, we also know that many of these leaders are not receiving the support or insights from their boards to navigate their burnout and their stress, especially if they have an additional identity that is impacted by burnout, which we'll talk about towards the end of our conversation today. Alrighty, let's go ahead and talk about our next group, which is frontline workers. And personally, I feel like frontline workers have been in the burnout spotlight since the onset of the pandemic. So much of our burnout conversations have been focused on frontline and essential workers. And 6 years later, we are still seeing the same challenges and we're having a lot of the same conversations. So we gathered our insights on frontline workers from the Center for Economic and Policy Research, Candid, and Building Movement Project. What we learned is that those who are closest to direct service work have a high risk of exposure to vicarious trauma. And given that the demographics of frontline workers tends to be women, people of color, immigrants, and low-income individuals, we also see challenges with these populations in being able to advocate for their needs. That includes advocating for fair compensation or advocating for just having their voices heard in big decision making processes, especially when the decisions impact them. And what is interesting about this challenge for frontline workers is that they tend to be the backbone of many organizations within the human service sector. So that burnout is then connected to recognizing that they are critical workers, they are essential workers, but they're not receiving equitable support or feeling like they have equity in their voice. Okay, let's go ahead and look at our fourth population. And this is fundraising professionals. If I am being honest, folks, this one hits home very closely to me. It's close to my heart because I worked as a fundraising professional during the pandemic, and the type of burnout that I encountered was something like I never experienced before. My own stories of burnout as a fundraising professional are backed by research that we read from the Association for Fundraising Professionals, also known as AFP. What we read is that people in the fundraising profession are considering leaving their jobs at very alarming rates. Over 50% are considering leaving. And we also know that folks in these professions are feeling pressures linked to donor volatility and unrealistic revenue targets. Additionally, and I can really relate to this next one, similar to executive directors and CEOs, fundraising professionals are navigating what we are calling a survival burden. So they recognize that their job duties dictate the livelihoods of not just the constituents and the communities that they serve, right? They have to raise money to make sure that people have access to things, can access resources. But what we also see with fundraising professionals is that that survival burden is present and how much they feel like they have to raise money so that their staff and their colleagues, their friends can keep their jobs. This is a very, very, very nuanced experience of burnout that is honestly very troubling during these times when and where fundraising efforts are becoming more and more challenging and very uncertain. Okay, we are almost, or just about actually, halfway through our list. Just want to remind you all that if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please use the comment section. We are monitoring that, keeping an eye on any of the questions that you have so that we can make sure that you feel like your voice is included in this dialogue. So, our next population is immigrant serving organizations and their leaders. There is growing research on the burnout that these leaders are experiencing, especially when these leaders are immigrants themselves and or they have family that is directly connected by anti-immigrant rhetoric. This research has been tracked for several years now, including data that we pulled from a 2022 report from the Weingart Foundation and the California Community Foundation that stated that almost 90% of immigration nonprofit staff found their work to be emotionally exhausting. And that was in 2022. We know that since 2025, this pressure has intensified for staff due to safety concerns and threats directed toward staff. What we tend to see with this group is that burnout is directly related to ongoing hypervigilance, which takes a serious toll on an individual's physical, mental, and behavioral health. And this ties directly into our next group, which are those that have lived experience, also known as PWLE, or people with lived experience. Similarly, there is a growing body of research of how nonprofit workers with lived experience are at risk of burnout. At Do Good Leadership Collective, we've done a considerable amount of work with lived experience staff, knowing that their jobs can pose risks of re-traumatization, especially if and when they're working with organizations who claim to value their lived experience, but don't set up the necessary infrastructure, supervision, trainings, or other supports that actually protect these individuals as they navigate professional landscapes. We encourage you to look into the work of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation that offers a vicarious trauma fact sheet and the risks that emerge when people who are exposed to trauma narratives that are directly connected to their own story really can struggle in their jobs. And so again, lived experience staff are face very unique risks because they often show up for this work because of the mission is directly connected to something that they've experienced, and it feels very purposeful. It feels very aligned with them to get into nonprofit work that helps them to solve and address the social inequities that they experience themselves. But what comes with that job is the risk of burning out because of the exposure to re-traumatization. Okay. Last but certainly not least are our nonprofit comrades who identify as transgender or non binary. Now, I did not say this earlier, but when it comes to carrying a marginalized identity, people may already be at risk of burnout because of things like microaggressions or macroaggressions in the form of racism or transphobia. This is especially true for our transgender and non binary communities as society as a whole continues to push them to the margin and threatens their existence and dignity. Unfortunately, this shows up in workplace settings, even in nonprofit workplace settings that pride themselves on being compassionate places to work. We know that these populations with these identities still face a high rate of discrimination in the workplace, misgendering, and psychological distress. We also found in research from Candid that non binary led organizations operate with significantly fewer financial resources than their gender conforming peers. Okay, friends. So that is our full list of our 7 populations that are having unique experiences with burnout in nonprofit and social impact workspaces. But you might be wondering in this moment, what happens if someone identifies with multiple populations, right? What if someone identifies with more than one of the populations that we listed in our presentation? That leads us to a very important conversation about the work of intersectionality. So, for example, when we consider the intersectionality of Black leaders who are also nonprofits or nonprofit CEOs or nonprofit executive directors, or when we consider the frontline worker who also identifies as non-binary, or we consider someone like me, a fundraising professional who is also a Black leader, who also had lived experience that was directly connected to the organization's mission. When we consider all of these intersectionalities, we have to recognize that the experience of workplace stress and burnout will be fundamentally different from the ways that any single personal profile can capture. And that's why we really drive home this point that there is no one size fits all approach to managing and dealing with burnout. This work is very complex. I'm sure our last handful of slides have shown that to you, that burnout arises for very unique and nuanced and complex reasons, which requires us to move past these surface level wellness perks and start asking how we can take a more equitable and systemic approach to dismantling burnout through things like organizational strategy, organizational operations, and funding overall. And if you've been following us at Do Good Leadership Collective, or you've been following me on LinkedIn for a while, you know that I've said this before. I am tired of talking about burnout, or honestly, I'm burnt out from talking about burnout, especially when there are seemingly not enough resources or innovations to solve the burnout crisis. And that is why I want to remind our listeners that Do Good Leadership Collective always, always, always has free resources available for leaders and their teams who are facing burnout challenges and wanting to take action. So some of these resources include 2 blogs, including our bi-weekly well-being brief. It comes out every other Monday on LinkedIn, and it includes resources on burnout research, but more importantly, it includes examples of well-being innovations that are happening across the United States and beyond. What's cool about the innovations is that we're seeing them come from a lot of different places. We're seeing innovations in philanthropy, innovations within nonprofits themselves, innovations within local government, innovations at the corporate level. So it's a really wonderful resource to follow in case you can benefit from having access to data on burnout, but also access to data on what people are doing about it. We have another blog over on our website. It's called the Cultures of Wellbeing blog series. And it's a place where you can access and read about topics like how to integrate rest into your nonprofit organization, or how to create processing space for your staff within your organization, especially during incredibly challenging times. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we have an entire landing page, an entire resource page that is dedicated to the work that we're talking about right now, the who, burns out, and why. So if you go to our website, you will find a landing page for this work, and that includes a free resource toolkit for managers and supervisors that can start using these resources today to start to navigate and start burnout conversations with their teams. And finally, because I have everyone's attention here, we want to let you know that we're offering something very special this summer, which we are affectionately titling Wellbeing House Calls. This is a service we've been experimenting with and offering throughout 2026. And this summer, we're really, really happy to share that we're able to offer 3 complimentary spots. Yes, we have 3 free spots available for our services that we call our well-being house calls. And in a moment, I'm going to throw up our interest form via a QR code in case you want to submit your interest in this program. It's a very, very quick, very short Google form that'll allow you to share some information so that we can learn more about you and your teams and the support that you might need. So just to break down what the Wellbeing House Calls are, first and foremost, this is for nonprofit teams that are ready to take the next step in managing burnout. We are offering this complimentary package that includes 1 discovery call, a team survey, and then it concludes with either a team presentation or a team report that has suggested next steps on how to navigate the unique burnout challenges within your team. And it is directly connected to what we presented on today, recognizing that burnout is an issue of equity, burnout is an issue of systems, and burnout is very unique to the individual experience. And so the Wellbeing House Call is ultimately us coming to you and saying, what's going on with your people and how can we help? Like I mentioned, we have 3 spots available for teams that want to start this work sometime between July 1st and August 31st of this year. And the reason we're choosing the summer is because if you know, like I know, the fall can be a hugely stressful time for nonprofits. And so we want to make this resource available at a time when teams might have an opportunity to slow down a little bit and reflect. And finally, why are we doing this? As if you have noticed, I really like talking about our why. Why is this important? Why are we talking about it? Like I said, I am burnt out about talking about burnout without meaningful and accessible well-being solutions. And so Do Good Leadership Collective is stepping up and offering our help. Like I mentioned, there is a QR code in the top left corner of this screen that'll bring you to a short Google form. If you're interested in learning more about the free well-being house calls, just fill out that form. I'm also going to pop up my email in a moment in case you just want to get in touch and learn more information. Okay, and here comes my email in the bottom left in case you want to get in touch. And we're getting towards the end of our presentation, folks, where we're making time for Q&A. So I'm going to jump over to our comments. Looks like we've had a few things come in. Excellent. We've got folks sharing their thanks, appreciating the conversation, looking forward to enjoying the tools. You are all very welcome. Okay, great. We're streaming this in a couple of different places. We're on LinkedIn, we're on YouTube, so we're navigating questions from a few different places. I'm going to start with this first one. Someone said that this was very helpful. I am not a manager or supervisor, but I would like for these conversations to start taking place with my team and in my workplace. Any suggestions? Yes, of course, of course, of course. So, like I mentioned, we have an entire resource page that is dedicated to this work of who burns out and why. It has the white paper, which is an excellent read. It has an infographic for all of our visual learners out there. And like I mentioned, it has a free resource toolkit, and it is organized and shared in the form of being relevant and supportive for managers and supervisors. But what I want to name is that anyone and everyone can use these resources because the free toolkit includes a slide deck in case you're ever in a position to do a presentation on burnout, but also includes a number of different downloads and worksheets that you yourself can take, and also worksheets that you can share with your peers and share with your colleagues. So to answer your question, if you're not a manager, if you're not a supervisor, but you feel like these conversations need to start, my recommendation is that you still go download that resource, utilize it for yourself, and then find your peers. find your allies, find the people within your organization, maybe within your team, that would be really interested in looking at this information with you. And it doesn't mean that you have to lead with it. It doesn't mean you have to tell your boss about it. It doesn't mean at the next all staff meeting that you have to present it, but you just start the conversations with like minded peers that are interested in having this conversation alongside you. There is strength in numbers. And especially if you're working in an organization where top leadership isn't really ready for these conversations, you can still lead and you can still build the momentum around this work by finding people to walk alongside you in this conversation. So, my suggestion is to download the resources, educate yourself on this work, find your buddies, find your peers that want to do this work with you, and then build momentum in numbers. It's a really great question. Thank you so much for asking that. Okay, we have another question here coming in from LinkedIn. You are very welcome. What is a very small team? What is a minimum? Yes, thank you for answering this question. So again, if you use the QR code, it'll bring you to a Google form. One of the questions that we have in there is how big is your team? The smallest team we'll take is two. A team of two is perfectly good. Unfortunately, at this time, the Wellbeing House Call is not available on a one-on-one basis. That is a service that we do offer through Do Good Leadership Collective. We offer one-on-one coaching, one-on-one advising, one-on-one support. But right now, the offering that we have is for teams. And if you are a team of at least two, you are eligible. So please consider applying. Okay. Another question popping up from LinkedIn. What would you say is the number one tool or skill we can develop to prevent burnouts? Ooh, excellent question. And if I'm being honest, it's a bit of a tricky one for me to answer because I'm curious about more of the context. So maybe I'll give a few different examples. So if we're thinking about developing skills to prevent burnout at the individual level, like I am taking care of myself, I'm taking care of my burnout. The number one skill that I think folks have to develop is connection to self, which then leads to self advocacy. Like I said before, and like I always like to elevate from the work of Dr. Christina Maslock, burnout is not an individual issue. It is not an individual failing. Now, that does not negate that there is individual accountability required in managing burnout. We have to be taking care of ourselves, hard stop. But at the same time, and we wrote this in the white paper, there is no amount of self-care that is going to solve burnout that is coming from an organization or coming from an institution, which then means that at an individual level, the skill that you need is knowing yourself, having self-awareness. And I mean self-awareness on a cognitive level, an emotional level, a physical level. You need to know what's going on with your body. You need to know how to articulate your emotions. You need to know how to understand how you're feeling, what you're thinking. And then the more you know about yourself, the more you can then advocate for yourself. The more you can then go to your team, go to your supervisor, go to your board and say, I am aware of what's going on with me. And because I'm aware of what's going on with me, I need you all to know about what I need. And this is what I'm going to advocate for. So that's the number one skill that I think folks need at the individual level. And at Do Good Leadership Collective, we do help people with that. We do help coach to building the confidence to not just do your work well, but to take care of yourself and advocate for yourself well. And then I'm going to answer this question in a second way. What would you say is the number one tool skill we can develop to prevent burnout? I'm going to answer that from the perspective of being a manager. And now I'm trying to prevent burnout for others, for my team, for my colleagues. I think very similarly, it is about awareness, not just awareness of self, but awareness of who is on your team. And that is why the Who Burns Out and Why resource is such an important one, because it really invites managers and board members and funders and people who support nonprofits as a whole to take a moment and recognize that people are uniquely impacted by burnout because of the very nature of wanting to be in this work and with the roles and the identities that come with doing this work. So the more time we can take to understand how our Gen Z colleagues are experiencing stress versus our baby boomer colleagues versus our Black peers versus our queer peers, the more we take the time to really listen and understand the unique stress that people are experiencing because of their identity or because of our roles, the more we can take time to have collective and shared conversations about what is actually needed. One of the things that we love about the well-being house calls and why we're offering them complimentary this year is because we, or I should say, I cannot decide how you and your team defines well being. And I think that's where we get stuck in this work. I think there are a lot of groups, people, institutions who are very well meaning, but they've already decided for people what well being or what recovery or what help is going to look like. In reality, it's going to differ from each person, it's going to differ from each team. And we cannot know what a team needs unless we take the time to listen. So, the number one skill we can develop to prevent burnout with our teams is to pause, listen to understand, ask important questions about people's experience of stress, and then have collective, co created conversations about how we develop something together that can meet the needs of everybody on the team. Folks, these are really excellent questions. Thank you so much. And if there's a question that you want to ask more thoroughly, please remember that my email is at the bottom left corner of the screen. Please reach out. Okay, two more questions before we wrap things up. This one coming from another area. What other populations are showing research about burnouts? Good question. So, yes, in our work today, we covered seven unique populations. This list is not exhaustive. If I'm being frank, y'all, I think that everyone is burnt out in some way, shape, or form. But what this work today elevated is that there's people who are burning out at disproportionate rates. In addition to the seven populations that we covered in our work today, the two additional ones that I think has some growing research around are women in nonprofit spaces and people who work within conservation and environmental spaces. So, what we know to be true about women in nonprofit work is that they make up the majority of nonprofit workers. There's more women and female identifying people in nonprofit spaces than there are men. And even with that data point, women still make less than the man's dollar in the nonprofit space. So there's more women working in the sector, but they are still experiencing wage equity when it comes to doing this work in nonprofit spaces. There's also growing research around just the different leadership styles that women bring into nonprofit spaces, knowing that women tend to have a depth of compassion that's akin to that gender, and and how then that shows up in the form of vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. So that's one population that I think has some more research about it. And then the second one I mentioned was environmental workers, folks that work in conservation. I think, especially in light of the new administration pulling back on things like climate change and conservation support and building data centers that is creating more environmental inequities, people who work in that environmental space and who have been fighting tooth and nail to put conservation on the map and to take care of our planets are really feeling some hopelessness right now, are really feeling stuck, are facing budget cuts like many other groups are, and are just feeling like they can't move the needle forward on a mission that is incredibly critical and important to them. So, great question. A lot of growing research about other populations outside of the ones that we covered today. And okay, I think this is our last one before we wrap it up, which is, what types of organizations does Do Good Leadership Collective work with? So I said at the top that the majority of the groups that we're working with are nonprofit organizations. We work with community-based organizations. We also work with philanthropic institutions. I would say that the majority of the teams that we're working with are teams under 50 people. And we tend to work with groups that have a mission or some priority that is related to equitable access. And that shows up in a lot of different ways. We work with teams that want to make sure that people have equitable access to the outdoors, or equitable access to healthcare, or equitable access to the arts. We are definitely most aligned with those groups who recognize that there are people in communities that are living in the margins in society, and that they need access and deserve dignity to live their most full, prosperous, and potential lives. And so that's who we really align our work with. And I think we find ourselves in those spaces because the people who then work within those organizations are experiencing very unique experiences of burnout related to making sure that people and communities have access, have justice, are experiencing equity. And that can cause a lot of burnout. And so we tend to help in those spaces where people are really focused on access and equity because that's also incredibly important to us. Okay, folks, I think that's it for our time today. If there are no other questions, we are going to wrap up this conversation. This recording will be available. We'll make sure to post it on LinkedIn, and we will also make sure to have it available on YouTube in case there is somebody you want to share it with, or in case you just want to listen back for some of the parts that you missed. Like I mentioned, my email is in the bottom left corner of the screen in case you want to reach out to me directly. There is a QR code at the top left corner of the screen in case you're interested in our well-being house calls. I'll jump back to that slide here so you can see more about what that information is. And then, of course, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I love having these conversations with people. Like I said before, I'm burnt out from talking about burnout, but I'm not burnt out about talking about solutions. And so if you're interested in just having a conversation with me, learning more, experimenting, brainstorming, please reach out. Please share these resources with your peers, with your colleagues, with your nonprofit comrades, with your board members, with your funders, so we can keep continuing this conversation and finding collective solutions. Thank you, everyone who was here live with me today. If you're watching the recording, thank you so much for being here. Please share comments and questions if you have any, and we'll follow up with you as soon as we can. Enjoy the rest of your